I'm Danielle, and I'm an adult services librarian in Medford.
Hi, and I'm Kayla. I'm also one of the librarians in Medford in the Adult Services Department.
So thank you again for coming to Consider This Anti-Racism. Consider This programs are designed to spark provocative conversations about big ideas. This program is made possible with support from Oregon Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Oregon Cultural Trust. Tonight's program is also the first program for Rogue Reads, a winter program designed to encourage everyone in the Rogue Valley to read and discuss the same books with the goal of promoting reading and building community through conversation. Rogue Reads is sponsored in part by Jackson County Library Foundation, by Coastal Media, Jefferson Public Radio, and Rosebud Media. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services or our program sponsors. So tonight, in just a minute, we'll be hearing from our panelists, Amy Peterson, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coordinator at the Rogue Community College, and Marvin Woodard, Multicultural Resource Center Coordinator and Equity Coordinator for Racial Justice at Southern Oregon University. They'll introduce themselves and share a little bit about them and their work, and then we'll jump into the panelist discussion questions. About halfway through, we'll take a quick break to use the restroom and stretch and all that. Then we'll jump back into the discussion for the rest of the program. Don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat box when they come up, including difficult questions. We do want people to ask any questions and don't be afraid to initiate those hard conversations. That's what this program is about, and we want that from the audience as well. We just ask that everyone agrees to be respectful of each other, the library staff, and our panelists, and to listen with an open mind. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Amy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So is this just the quick introduction, or are we jumping into question number one?
Go ahead and give yourself a quick introduction, and then I'll do the question number one after that.
Okay, perfect. So hi, everyone. My name is Amy Peterson. I do work at Rogue Community College as our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Coordinator. A little bit of background about myself is that I am fairly new to Southern Oregon. I moved to Grants Pass back in about March. And it's been a whirlwind getting to know the area during a time of a pandemic. And so I've been learning a lot about the community, townspeople, and a lot of the connections that Rogue Community College has to many of the districts and areas nearby. And so I'll leave it at that for now.
All right, thank you. Oh, Marvin, go ahead.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you wanted to lead in. Go ahead, you can do the lead in. Hi, everyone. I'm Marvin Woodard. My pronouns are he, him, his. I have been in Southern Oregon now for 20 years, but in Oregon for 27 years as a college student, young professional, and now a middle-aged professional. Raised my two daughters, my wife and I. Lisa, have raised our two daughters in Central Point, and have been engaged in many different scenes around here, from volleyball to basketball to some of the activism work that has been coming up lately. But we've been engaged in this valley for a good 20 years strong, and have really grown attached to this place. Being that I'm from Southwest Louisiana, I've grown very attached to the Rogue Valley and when the potential that we have, and anxious to answer any questions you might have about anti-racism and the work that we do to help that potential manifest.
Awesome, thank you. So we'll go ahead and just jump right in. The first question builds on your introduction a little bit. And the question is, what is your professional background and how does it relate to anti-racism work or empowering racial minorities? And either of you can go first, just go ahead and jump in.
All right, I'll go. So I think the question is interesting because for myself, when I talk about my professional work, I also have to talk about my personal background. And so I just want to share some more information as it relates to that. So for myself, I am an Asian American woman. I am mixed race. And so I grew up with a Chinese mother who came from Vietnam as an immigrant. And my father is a first generation white man veteran who we think is Italian, but we're not quite sure. And I grew up in California in a predominantly white and Hispanic area. very large in agricultural activities, lots of farmers. It's the kind of place not too dissimilar from Grants Pass, where you would also be expected to find maybe a church on every street corner, along with the taco shop. And so that's kind of the background that I grew up in. And, you know, at my high school, I was the only person who really kind of knew what Chinese New Year was, and that the delicious soup, the Vietnamese soup, is pho, not pho. And so that kind of puts some context into how I grew up. And then I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, where I majored in English. And while I was there, I was also a resident assistant, meaning that I lived in the dorms and I worked to respond to a lot of incidents that happened where students were living. And while I was there, I kind of had like a mixed race existential crisis where I started to discover myself and also start to question about what does it mean to be an Asian American now in Berkeley, in a place that is predominantly Asian American now, when I first came from a place that was not. And the fact that I'm a resident assistant and I look around at my peers and I see that there are a lot of issues that were going on, obstacles that were coming from the fact that some of my peers were coming from low SES status, they're having mental health crises, but there was also a stigma against seeking help. And there was just a general housing crisis as well during the time when I was in Berkeley. I'm sure there still is right now as well. And so that all kind of led me into wanting to help people. And that's what guided me towards moving to Arizona and entering into a graduate program for counseling student affairs, which is basically just a fancy degree that lets me work at universities and colleges with a special understanding in student development theory. And so while I was there in Arizona, I worked in the Dean of Students office as the grad assistant for conduct, which sounds very much like a conversation starter for many people that I speak with, because a general reaction that I get is like, oh, you worked with the bad students. And it's like, no, I didn't work with the bad students. I worked with the students who were misunderstood, or the ones who were displaying symptoms of behavior that was part of a bigger problem. And so from there, I really became passionate about trying to understand people and the intersectionality of their identities and how that comes to play into the world. And that's part of the reason of what brought me here to the Valley. So, when RCC was looking for an EDI coordinator, I just saw it as a great opportunity to continue to do this kind of work. And so I'm literally here where I am today because of where I come from, my background, my family, and the personal passions that I have. So I think I've talked enough. So I'll hand it over to Marvin.
Amy and I have a lot in common with our story. To see where I'm at, I have to go back to where I was. And I grew up in Southwest Louisiana. If you draw the boot, I'm on a hill about 40 minutes from the Gulf of Mexico in Moss Bluff, Louisiana. And I was definitely one of the more privileged kids in that the community I grew up with was 35 homes there, and everyone's kin by blood. And uncles, aunts, 5th cousin, 8th cousin, 10th cousin, didn't matter. Grandmothers were right there. And so we grew up in a very matriarchal community, but then everyone was kin. And within that community, you would see your cousins who were white, your cousins who had married Latinas or Latinos, and they would come in, your cousins who were part of the queer community that lived right there next door with you, or you celebrated your birthday with them, your dad's cousins who were up and down the spectrum as far as identities. So I grew up in a place where the Rainbow Coalition was really within my neighborhood. And so a lot of the tough questions that others were dealing with in the 2000s, I had come to terms with because it was simply family. And while I phenotypically identify as African American, I also have to acknowledge that my grandmother, who was part white, Native American, and African American, was very Creole. So we've taken a great deal of pride in that piece in our family, knowing that we can go and look at our family tree and point out exactly who is what, and when it happened. And that gave me a different lens when it came to moving outside of Louisiana and to other realms. my background is in engineering. I'm a manufacturing engineering technologist, which is just a hair away from a mechanical engineer. Some people call it a process engineer. So during my time at Oregon Tech, when I came in '93, dove into clubs and organizations, working with the Black Student Union, the Latino Student Union, our Native American and National Student Associations, and built real solid relationships out of those, and realized how much I enjoyed working with these students and being part of their team. But I was also part of a Big Brother program, basically, because friends would contact me to talk to their young Black men who just had not had anyone to really sit down with them and talk to them outside of an Oregonian perspective. So I kind of got drug into some conversations that led me to think that, wow, I didn't have to explain Blackness until I got to Oregon. Being from the South, going to school in Mississippi for a couple of years, and then coming up to Oregon, it was never a question of what does it mean to be Black, coming from those who are part of the Black community, as well as those who are not identified as part of the Black community. So upon completing my degree, had an opportunity to stay in higher ed and still work with those same populations, work with those groups, as well as recruit them into the institute. And then I realized that I really enjoyed that process, the process of discovering who I am, what my strengths are, where my weaknesses are, or my opportunities for growth are, not necessarily weaknesses, but my opportunities for growth are. And then all of the different struggles that came with that. How do we negotiate our way through those things? How do we navigate our way through the bureaucracy or the red tape that might be in the way of these negotiations? So when I started realizing that I enjoyed working with students who were going through those types of things, I had an aha moment of how I had to go through the same thing, and I had a counselor to help me go through it. And so that was kind of it for me at that point. I realized that yes, I can program a CNC lathe. Yes, I can work with robots. Yes, I can take care of technical writing. But the most satisfaction I would get in my life, and if I really had paid attention to my mother when she told me to go be a teacher, counselor, advisor, do anything working with people, I probably wouldn't have gone the engineering route. But it gave me a skill set as far as how to deal with processes that I have now turned over into how to help deal with the human process of being a person of a BIPOC person or a Black Indigenous person of color in a predominantly white world in this part of the country. So it's I kind of fell into it honestly, and I fell into it because I realized that a lot of these students, including the white students, were looking for a way to communicate, a way to connect, and a way to build relationships that really matter, and which to me look a lot like my family. So I wanted to do this because this reminds me of working with my family in the long run.
Marvin, I love that. I was just thinking as you were talking about how you and I, we're obviously from different backgrounds, but we're both motivated by this wanting to give back to our communities of where we came from.
Mm-hmm.
Like for me, I first started off thinking, I want to work with people who look like me, because sometimes I go into spaces and I don't see people who look like me. But that has become even more expansive, where it's like, well, I want to do this work even in spaces where I might be the only Asian American person, or I might be the only mixed race person as well, to give perspective, because it's still giving back to a community. I think that as I grew over time, what that looked like has changed in my head. Growing up, it looked like people who looked like me, who looked like my cousins, on my mom's side, mainly. But then it started to change into people who also look like people on my dad's side. Or, as my family has grown, I became an aunt at the age of 8. And so I have nieces and nephews who are 1/4 Chinese, 3/4 something else. And you start to see the connection of all of that, and just wanting to form, a better space for everyone that you end up connected to.
That's exactly it. You ding, ding, ding. I mean, just right on the nose. And it really is about that servant's heart, realizing that there were a lot of people that helped me get to where I needed to be, not necessarily where I wanted to be, but where I needed to be. And if that really is the truth, then it's never going to stop, right? There's always going to be people who need those folks, and I just value that, between being part of a basketball team, playing for Dan Miles, being part of the Wayne Tex Hollis's road crew so we can go recruit, or just working within the clubs and having Miss Millie, hold us accountable to doing what we said we are going to do. It was so important, but those people became my family, my most trusted people, away from my family. And I just couldn't shake that. As they've given to me, I want to give back.
So I hope everyone hears that diversity work is about giving back. It's about connections with friends, family, the community.
Absolutely.
Awesome, thank you. Question 2, what is the difference between a person being not racist and being anti-racist?
Marvin, I went first last time, so I'm calling you.
Wonderful. Well, action and defensiveness, right? Protect myself versus engaging in the work. So I think of it, and I had this conversation with another very, very close friend of mine, and we're on opposite ends of the spectrums on a lot of things, but we have a really unique relationship in that we really complete each other because we have these opposite views, and it gives us an opportunity to really understand, to dig into a true dialogue so that we're able to keep learning and keep pushing each other to learn, which is nice. And he's asked that before, and I broke it to him like this. There's one thing when people come in and say, I'm not a bad person. Not a bad person says that you don't go out there and do anything that necessarily gets you in trouble or necessarily gets you pointed out in public, but you don't necessarily go out there and stop things that are happening. So I'm not a bad person is almost a defensive mechanism to say that I'm not engaged in this stuff. I'm not part of that problem, versus I'm an engaged community citizen and want to be a good community citizen, which means I'm engaged in the issues of that community. I want to find out what's working, what's not working, because if I can improve it for someone else, it will improve it for me as well. That's the difference between not being a racist. I'm not a racist. I might not be engaged in the work. I don't actively go out there and do things that people are going to say that are bad. But at the same time, I'm not interrupting it. I'm not calling it out. I'm not finding ways to stand in the gap for when those racist moments show up, which is what an anti-racist does. They look at those systems. They look at how racism pollutes the society that they are in, and they say, what do we need to do in order for us to be better? How do I start with myself? How do I start with myself and remove the biases that I have in place, those views and those lenses that aren't conducive to being a productive member of a diverse and inclusive society? How do I tackle that with me in a way that honors others that are willing to help me? And then how do I take that which I have discovered in myself and apply it in a way to help my community? So to me, I boil it down, and I know that's oversimplifying it, and I'm sure Amy is going to agree with me that I really am oversimplifying it. There's wonderful books about it. There's wonderful TED Talks about it, about the difference between not being a racist and being an anti-racist. For me, it boils to I'm not a bad person. I'm an engaged citizen that's doing the work that to make things matter. That's the difference for me. Are you engaged in the work? Are you talking about it? Are you working through your own stuff and confronting it head on? Are you building a collection of collaborators or co-conspirators with you to help you unpack you so that you can help unpack your community and destroy some of these systemic barriers that are out there? That's the work of an anti-racist compared to someone who's just not a racist and is content to stay out of the fight, out of the issues. Because if you're staying out of it and it's happening around you, then you're not a unique part of it. You're just part of that white supremacy culture that has been upheld by it.
Yeah, I completely agree. The sentiment of being not racist just reminds me of inaction, whereas anti-racism really is about involvement and a re-empowerment of taking over your ability to make a difference in other people's lives as well. Racism exists when one group has power and influence over another. And that racism can look like a spectrum. That's kind of what Marvin was talking about, where sometimes it can look downright evil, if you will. The extreme version of terrorism or of racism is terrorism. But then the more subtle versions of it is also denial. And I think that's what Marvin was alluding to as well, where it's thoughts like saying, well, that's a them people problem. That's not a my people problem. or thoughts like, I can't be privileged because I'm poor, or because I have this other identity that disenfranchises me, and therefore I just can't be racist. This line of thinking is racist, though, if you're part of the group that has power and influence over another. And so, Marvin mentioned that there's research out there. There's also history about this out there as well, that has shown that a white population in America has advantages over people of color. And we see this in things like the amount of Black and brown people that are in prison for petty crimes. But then we have Kyle Rittenhouse, who's not in prison for murdering 2 people in Kenosha, who's also white. And so there is research out there on critical race theory, on racial trauma being inheritable between generations. And I think it's just a fact of, we're currently at a time in our social political climate where people need to be more involved in anti-racism work. I don't think that we've seen that kind of activism or that kind of conversations occurring, at least not in common circles. If it was being talked about before, I think it was kind of being hidden away, or it wasn't being widespread, more common knowledge. And so to me, that's the difference between just not being a racist and anti-racism work. Again, it's that inaction versus action. That call to action really is anti-racism work.
Forgot to unmute myself. Thank you. Question 3. What role does journalism play in shaping popular opinion about race and racism in America? If either of you want to go first.
Can you just stop at journalism? Because right now, we're looking at how people get their information. I mean, we are very divided as a country. And so people are buying into what they want to buy in, how they want to buy into it, and not necessarily looking at the sources, or even just doing the homework themselves to figure out what are those realities around these thoughts and these beliefs. And so I think journalism can be exactly what it can be to whoever it needs to be for, right? And I say that because I'm thinking about all of the articles I just flip through on my Flipboard every single day, and I do my best to hear everyone's side, because if I'm going to have a dialogue, not a conversation or a debate, a discussion or a debate, and I think that's important. Journalists who are actually getting information that is grounded in truth and putting it on the board on the table for you to then go through, decipher yourself, which we will keep, and how you're going to keep it, and then your ability to go out and research it from there is incredibly important when it comes to shaping your views around other cultures and other identities. You look at how the black male was portrayed in the 80s, that super predator, right? All of that good stuff that came through in the 90s, I always a threat. My mom used to tell me, and then I would see it on television as well. I would see it. My mom used to tell me that there's nothing more threatening than a young, educated black man, unless he's walking outside at night. And then you're the most terrifying thing in the world. And then you would see those images through journals, through the news and other media, right? You would find out that people are paying attention to it. Who's getting arrested on television? And it's not just journalism, it's all of media. It's all of it. You can't give it just to one section. How are they portraying those particular cultures? Now, I talk about the Black culture because that is obviously the one I'm closely aligned with. But when I see it, I'm sometimes absolutely heartbroken. I know now that there's definitely more of a conscience around, are we reporting fairly? Are we giving people truths? But at the same time, there's still mistakes. I mean, look at the Macy's Day Parade, a Black dance group, when actually it's a Black historically Black Greek lettered organization that has been around 100 years celebrating their centennial, but they were watered down to just a Black dance group. So, messaging is everything. How you're getting it, who you're getting it from is everything. And I go back to watching the news and my daughter, my oldest daughter, sitting on my lap, and I'm not thinking she's paying attention to the news, and she starts crying, and she says, "Why do people who look like you get taken down by the police all the time?" That's what she said. "Why do you get taken down by the police all the time?" That was coming from the news. That's what she saw. And so incredible role in how they can get the word out about different cultures, how we celebrate, how we're prejudiced. They have an incredible role in it, and it's very important that that role, as far as making sure that they're communicating out, is grounded in truth.
I think that another word that applies to what Marvin is saying, and I swear that he and I did not, consult with each other before tonight. We're just kind of winging it. But the word implicit bias comes immediately to mind with all the examples that Marvin has been talking about, where, people's beliefs are being formed by what they see on the media, from journalism. And it's contributing to these implicit beliefs and these implicit myths, if you will, that then turns into subconscious actions that we see. And so something about implicit bias too is if you're not looking for it, you're not going to see it. And so you're not necessarily going to automatically recognize that some of your actions are being influenced by the things that you're reading, by the things that you are consuming in social media as well. But that's very much true. Marvin talked about it with his daughter. She started to absorb some of that information that's going out there, but because of her background, she was able to apply it and see her dad and her dad being affected. But what about other children who don't have the same background as Marvin's daughter? What are they seeing? What are they absorbing? And what are they learning from all of those, like journalism tactics, if you will, the way that they're presenting the information? Perhaps it's part truth, but it's also shaded truth that is being manipulated. And I think that causes a lot of, I would just say, misunderstandings between people of different backgrounds. And so that is something to be very vigilant about and aware about. And so I'm glad that we asked that question as well, because I was thinking about it. I didn't really start to have a critical reflection about the stuff that I was reading or the sources of where that information was coming from until I actually went to college and I took a journalism class. It was Berkeley Medical Journal. And we were taught, how do you look at accurate sources? What are some key indicators that someone is reputable or not? That wasn't something that they taught you in elementary school or necessarily even in high school as well. And so I'm very glad that we're having conversations like this, because it does need to be recognized. What you were exposed to for however many hours of the day. Like I think of Facebook. How many hours of the day am I on Facebook? Probably a lot. And so obviously you're going to be influenced by that amount of exposure. And so you do need to be conscious about that as well.
I want to, again, we did not coordinate this. We're going to call it life experiences and kindred spirits. When journalists or any media is out there painting a picture of any cultural identity, we have to remember that's also part of the cycle of oppression that happens, right? From the messaging you get when you're a tiny baby, you can do anything, And I'll use myself as an example. You can do anything, but maybe not be president. That used to be the joke in 1970 something, right? With your uncles and your dad and cousins who were older. You could do anything, but maybe not be president. And so the messaging comes in, you're a strong Black, all of the intersectional messages that you are a Black boy, capable, strong-spirited Christian. You can do those, that is solid. And then you get away from those family members, you get into your schools and everything else, you start to hear more about you're an athlete, you're funny, you're all those other things that show up in that personal identity formation phase. But then you start getting to where you recognize what the general public is saying through journalism, through other media. And when we talk about the implicit bias, and again, I go back to, you're a threat to America, you've been slaves, you're incarcerated at a higher rate, you're generally poor, you come from poor neighborhoods, you're usually a one parent household, you know, that messaging starts to take hold and it's being shaped through our outlets there. That implicit bias goes into other people's ears and they start to believe a lot of those stereotypes that are out there, right? They start to believe it and it just becomes ingrained. What we don't necessarily also talk about is that it's also internalized as those people who are the victims, and I'm gonna call it for what it is, that are the victims of these of these portrayals. They hear it enough, they start to not so much embrace it, but internalize it and hold on to it because that must be me. That of course, I'm not supposed to be here. Of course, I now have imposter syndrome and I'm supposed to be at this table, even though I'm a 48-year-old man who has a degree in engineering and close to another degree and even close to a third degree, but I don't know if I'm supposed to be here because I've heard this messaging all my life. And so now I have to talk myself out of it. I have to talk myself out of it. I have to make sure I don't reinforce that in my children, that fear, that imposter syndrome, that internalized racism that happens, all because of this cycle of oppression that has been put in place, that the media has a huge role in.
So we have a question from the audience, Amy and Marvin. Can you give recent examples of implicit bias that have been aimed at you?
I'm trying to think of an appropriate one to share.
That's kind of where I'm at. The last two that I've experienced have necessarily been implicit. I think one that has happened and the lady walked past me and when she walked past me, I called out her name and then she apologized profusely, but this was a while back, not recently, it's probably been a couple, 2 or 3 years now. I'm on a sidewalk talking to an African-American woman, both of us, we're having a serious conversation actually around a diversity training that we had just had. And we watched this lady who was white come towards us and we weren't blocking the sidewalk. We were just right there by the car talking. We weren't blocking the sidewalk. And she crossed the street way out in front of us. And when she crossed the street, I watched her and she grabbed her bag and she pulled her bag closer into her side and crossed the street. And when she got up a little ways, it dawned on me who she was. And I called her name and I said, "Hey, so-and-so." And just kind of waved at her. She goes, "Oh, Marvin, it's you. Oh, hey, Marvin, it's you." And when I hear, "Oh, hey, Marvin, it's you," a relief. And 2 days later, she came back and sat in my office and she apologized. And she said that's something that has been just deep down in her and she didn't realize it. She crossed the street, didn't even think about it. But she knew when I said her name that this is why I did it. Mm-hmm. This is why I did it. So I thank her for being honest and she is a friend. And I believe that there are moments where you have these ahas, this is me. And she had that moment and I'm glad it was with me because I'm not one to blow it out of proportion. Not so much what I'm not one to rub it in your face and tell you you're a bad person for it. You're not a bad person for something that's been programmed through this entire cycle for most of your life. And now you're unplugging from it and you go back to it every once in a while and unconsciously, which is that implicit piece.
Mm-hmm. I think that another word that we need to talk about is microaggressions, as well as just like overt racism as well. But, some of the things that come to mind, and I've shared this with other spaces as well, but, unfortunately, one of my first interactions that I had after moving here to Southern Oregon is I was walking with my partner just in the downtown area. And there was a woman who, was near us and we were wearing masks, but she wasn't. And she just kind of, I don't know, she got really close, uncomfortably close while we were walking past her. And she just looked at me and she said, "You're diseased." And as a Chinese American woman, that hits so different than I feel like it might for others. And something else that I've been experiencing as an Asian American is this kind of anger towards the Asian American community for the pandemic. I've seen it not necessarily directed at me by particular individuals, but I've seen it in online communities. I've seen it in comment sections of articles, where people can, post anonymously or behind a keyboard, stuff like that, saying sentiments that are just anti-Asian. And so those are just some recent examples that I can think off the top of my head. But then, like Marvin too was saying, there are other experiences that we have that it's not so implicit rather than explicit as well, where it's just blatant and out there. And so I would say throughout my life, I've experienced some of those things. But right now, I would say that my Asian American identity has become something that I think more about. It has been, or it has been intersecting with things that are being talked about right now. That there are other identities that I also hold that have also contributed to implicit bias reactions, such as the fact that I look racially ambiguous. And sometimes people think that I'm Hispanic and they will start speaking to me in Spanish and then become very surprised when I don't respond back in Spanish. Or when they realize I'm Chinese and they're like, oh, well, of course you're smart because you're Asian. Those are some of those other experiences that I've had as well.
We have one more question from the audience. Can you talk a bit about intrinsic bias versus racism? Recently, someone characterized someone else as having intrinsic bias, but since the person in question actually believes that a biracial person of color, people of color, are lesser than white people, it seems that this is not intrinsic bias, but rather racism. I felt like saying this person has intrinsic bias, which can be overcome with awareness and work, is giving this person a pass. You guys want me to read that again?
Give it one more time.
Okay.
Really let me chew it over.
Can you talk a bit about intrinsic bias versus racism? Recently, someone characterized someone else as having intrinsic bias, but since the person in question actually believes that biracial people of color are lesser than white people, it seems that this is not intrinsic bias, but rather racism. I felt like saying this person has intrinsic bias, which can be overcome with awareness and work, is giving this person a pass. Is this giving this person a pass?
That's just racist. There's another word for it. Intrinsic biases tend to be subconscious beliefs or stereotypes or things you act on and you don't even think about it. Step on a crack, break a mom's back. That's an intrinsic belief. Because it's stuck deep in your subconscious and it just comes up. To me, that borderlines on implicit bias as well. It feels like the same thing. I have not at any point had a conversation around intrinsic bias other than knowing that the subconscious piece is in place. But for someone to make that statement, that's just racist. That's not bias. That's just being a racist. That's being insensitive to the nth degree.
Yes. Just quite simply, yes. I think that with thoughts like that too, there needs to be a conversation about power and privilege and authority, because those are also components of racism. And so, I'm just curious, and I don't know if this is the space to flesh it out more, but the background of the person who's making those statements as well. Is it actually prejudice, or is it internalized oppression, perhaps, depending upon the identity of that person as well? There's so many different ways that you could also try to understand where that person is coming from. But I'm also going to stand by the fact that what they said is not okay. And in essence, it is racist, and therefore should be addressed. But when it comes to trying to understand the other person, I think that there's a lot more questions that I would have for them, in terms of, how did you start to form this opinion? Where is it being, supported or stemming from for you? Let's talk about that some more. I think that for situations like that, I would really want to see if that person would be open to having a conversation and how they came to have that particular thought pattern, because that will be even more revealing, I think, than just their statement alone. But again, like, I stand by also what Marvin was saying as well, where it's just plain racist. And that person needs to have a conversation with some people who care.
Thank you both for sharing, and thank you for sharing the personal experiences before. I'm going to go ahead and go to question number 4. Why is being colorblind or saying I don't see race problematic? How does this view further racial inequity?
Were y'all listening? So I mean, I couldn't even answer the question of how I came to be in this particular job without talking about my background. I hope that it's readily apparent at this point that you cannot cherry pick the characteristics of someone when you're trying to understand them. That's just going to end up in a bad time. Like, if you want to get to know me, Amy, you're going to have to learn about my mom, my dad, my sisters, my 19-year-old cat, like all the different stuff that makes me who I am. And when you say things like, I don't see race, you really just don't see me, or you're really not trying to care about me with comments like that either. Yeah, I see Marvin nodding his head a lot, and so I'm going to see if he has any comments as well.
Again, you're absolutely right. When I hear I don't see race, it means you don't see me. All of the identities that make me up, you can't, like Amy said, you can't just pick that one strand and that's the only strand you want to be interested in. Like, yes, I'm a man, but I'm a Black man, and that comes with a whole list of other things. I'm a Christian man, that comes with a whole list of other things. I'm a father, that comes with a whole list of other things. So to want to just pick out that one piece and say that's the only thing I see, you're just a human being, well, then you miss my ancestors' human experience, which has informed me on how to exist in this world and how to be safe in this world and how to be successful in this world. And so to dismiss all of that all of those trials and those triumphs, to not see them through me is, again, pretty insulting, because I am proud of them and I walk where I walk because of them. So you're going to hear about my parents, you're going to hear about my brothers, you're going to hear about my sisters, you're going to hear about my grandmothers, because I talk about them as strong women of color, strong Black women in their communities. And so when I'm talking about them and all the values that they have instilled in me, to say, well, I don't see color, miss the part of how they put those values into me.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, you devalue that person when you say that. You devalue that person's existence and that struggle that got them to where they're at, because in that struggle comes strength.
I think that too, when people say, I don't see race, I'm going to give a little example. I'm going to start telling you facts about myself, and I want you to reflect on the things that pop up in your mind as you start to imagine some of these things. So, my mom is Chinese. My mom came from Vietnam when she was 12. My father is a first-generation white man who we think is Italian, who's also a veteran. I am the youngest of 3 people, the youngest of 3 siblings. I became an aunt when I was 8 years old. And, hopefully just do that quick exercise. You start to see how, just with those simple statements, you started to build a picture about my background, about who I am. And I purposely started with the backgrounds of my parents, because now I'm mixed race. Now, if I tell you, so imagine Chinese New Year versus New Year's at my father's, those are also things that you could probably easily imagine the differences between. And so those are the kinds of things that we can't just pretend don't exist. You know they do. Obviously you do, because in your head you were building up pictures. So yeah, I just would like to, if I could, I would do that exercise with everyone who says I don't see race. I'm like, well, let me tell you some facts and you tell me what you imagine.
Right. And the other reason people say that we have to keep in mind is because they are uncomfortable with the ideal of having a conversation around race, being able to sit down and have a dialogue about race out of fear of being labeled, out of fear of making mistakes. Sometimes just out of the simple fact that they don't want to see race because then they have to confront some things that they have um, been complicit to, or maybe maybe some things they just flat out have done. And so this is their way of not confronting that. And I have friends who have said that, when we've sat down and we've had conversations, I used to say that, but, being around you now, I want to know exactly who you are, the whole you, not just a part of you. But I think I was like that because I was uncomfortable. I didn't know how to get to that point without upsetting or being disrespectful.
Mm-hmm. And to go off of that too, I personally think it is more disrespectful to tell me you don't see race than it is otherwise to acknowledge where I come from. It is honestly more polite to acknowledge where I come from. I just want to put that out there for those who are feeling nervous or anxious about having those kinds of conversations with people who have backgrounds different than themselves. I can tell you it's preferable. This is my personal experience, but I would rather someone say, hey, like, I'm just kind of curious about like your background. Can we just learn a little bit more about each other? Perfect. Great. Because I get to learn about you too. And it's not just like this weird game of, the elephant in the room to avoid is the most obvious thing, which is, our appearance or our backgrounds.
Thank you for sharing. We had one question come in from the chat.
All right. So our question is, often when someone says they are colorblind, I think they are evoking Martin Luther King's words, which ask us to put more emphasis on someone's character than their skin color. I know it is not acceptable today, but several decades ago, being colorblind was seen as a more enlightened point of view because it conveyed more of a meaning of equality rather than discounting someone due to the color of their skin. My question is this: what do you think of people who broadly denounce whitey and say that they are not racist? Sorry, there was two parts. What do you think of people who denounce whitey and say it is not racist?
I think they mean like a term whitey as in like a derogatory term towards white people, I think is the context they mean.
I can take a stab at this. So again, racism is when one group has power or influence and authority over another. And in America, it has been established through history, and at this point through research, through disaggregated data, that people who are white have more authority, more privilege, more access to things than people of color. And so when you're calling someone whitey, I think that comes from a place of being hurt. But depending on that person's background, they might not come from a group that has authority over others. And so this becomes really complicated, and that's where you get more into some critical race theory and some very technical terms. But you really need to look at the person who's saying it. What is their background? What is their experiences? How have they formed their opinion on believing that saying this is okay? And why do they believe that it's not racist? That's the true anti-racist reaction. The question is not whether or not is it racist, because we know that it's not okay. Really, it's more about how are we going to respond to people who say things like this? And if you want to get into some technical terms, Again, critical race theory is probably one of the best areas of research to deep dive into it, but it goes back into a question of, could this actually be seen as a prejudiced thought? Is it an internalized oppression type of thought as well if the person is white themselves? There's just a lot of other factors that you need to take into consideration as well. And I know that's very hard to do in a chat room, but hopefully other people will start to see too. When you hear or see comments like this, there's more to it than just what's at face value. You really need to have more context to understand and respond to it. And so that's just something that I'm going to say, like, obviously it's not okay to call people whitey. Like, let's not make that a trend. I don't want that to be a thing. But we should be having conversations on why that person thinks it's okay.
I guess I need context. I mean, there's a lot to it. Is it retaliatory? As Amy said, I think of power, privilege, and oppression. Is this retaliatory because I've been oppressed and now I'm holding on to that oppression and giving it back to you? I don't know how to answer that one because of just not enough context. How did it happen? Who was the person? Actually making that statement? Are these people of color now? And so I'm going to assume. I'm just going to jump out there and assume. Are we assuming that there's people of color retaliating back towards a person who has had authority or power over, again, the oppressor? And so when you hear it as a retaliation, it feels like that fight or flight has kicked in. I'm back to fighting. Versus what you hear when someone's been called the N-word, it is to denigrate you and make sure you know that you are the lowest of the low and not worth. So they and now we have to get into critical race theory, which then becomes both complicated and complex. So context for that particular one would be awesome. And then we can unpack that all day long because it is a hot one. It is a hot button one. It goes right up there where, can people of color be racist? Let's talk about racism as a structure. Let's talk about racism and how it arrives in the United States of America. And then we'll talk about whether or not people of color can be racist.
Yes, because once we understand the structure, once we have more understanding about that, then you can start to reflect on, where do I stand in that structure? Where do other people stand in that structure? And that's when you're going to have a productive dialogue.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I will say though, just from hearing the way that it was written, it sounds like that person was really laying out some bait for a reaction of some sort from other people, because I would agree, it's common knowledge at this point that it's not acceptable. And they're kind of goading other people into having some sort of reaction. And so that's just something that I would also keep in mind of, perhaps this person's also saying it because they know my background. They know I'm an EDI coordinator and they want to see how I'm going to react. There's so much factors to take into consideration as well, including, who's around when those comments are being made.
We also have a few more questions coming in. Next, what recommended resources would both of you suggest for people to read concerning critical race theory?
I'm a big believer of Google. So just go ahead and Google that, critical race theory, see what pops up as free PDFs from reputable site sources. But one woman that I think just gets under talked about is Kimberly Crenshaw. And so she was the woman who actually coined the term intersectionality. And so we've been talking about that this entire webinar, essentially, where we say you can't look at someone just in, siloed characteristics. You have to take them as a whole. She was one of the leading pioneers in that work. She was the one who came up with the word intersectionality. And I think that if you look into her work, she'll be able to present it in a way that's easily digestible as well. So if you didn't know her name before, that is one name that I do like to put out there.
I'd also say go take a look at her TED Talk as well. It's fantastic. I think she has a couple of them. If do I want you to jump right into wanting to read about critical race theory? Probably not. I probably want you to sit down and read something like um, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in a Cafeteria? Start there. Let's start with like some real understanding that slips into race theory, critical race theory throughout the book. But at least let's give you something that you can grab onto right now and understand. And and teachers have asked before, and I like to tell teachers, if you aren't sure, the same thing you're wanting to teach the students, you can go and learn for yourself. Go to teachingtolerance.org and just start scrolling through. And then I too am a huge fan of Google. If we try to lay out every resource that we think it will work for you, it will be tough. But if you go out there, you can find a lot of good things, and you can find some things that maybe aren't so good. But that's where information literacy becomes very important. Who are the people that I can talk to find out who are the people I can engage in dialogue with about these things that I have read and that I want to understand so that I can become a better engaged citizen around the issues of racism or anti-racist.
Or just go read a book by an author who has a background different than yourself. Right now I'm in a book group and we're reading an Indigenous people's history, and I'm not Native American, but I have learned so much about the actual history that has occurred to Native American peoples, as well as for myself, I constantly reflect on how is what I'm learning about one group going to influence my understanding of other groups as well. And so that's just one way to start of it. I'm thinking of a couple of months ago, there was kind of this urgent feeling of we all need to read about anti-racism work right now. And so we know that there are book guides out there as well that you can just easily look up right now. Just Google anti-racism book guides, and you'll be able to see that people have laid out a plethora of literature that has been written in the last decade on this topic, and it's coming from various levels. It could look as easy as, if you've got children, making sure that there's diversity in the books that you read to them. If you've got teenagers, all right, let's talk about healthy relationships and how to interact with people or how to de-escalate conflict. It's all going to intersect with your ability to have conversations on the hard topics. And so it doesn't have to be something formal. But I do recommend that you do a wide array of reading. It's when you stick to just one type or one source that you get stuck, essentially, in rereading the same stuff over and over again. So look at your bookshelf, expand that, and do it consistently. That's the probably best advice that I can give.
And do an inventory of yourself. I encourage everyone to go to Harvard's page and do the implicit association test. Find out what your biases are, and then start questioning your why. Why do I have these biases? How do I now re-educate myself around what I feel needs to be in place of these biases? How do I unpack it and repack it with the stuff that helps me get to that place where I'm more inclusive, more welcoming, more open to having the deeper dialogues about diversity and inclusion? So the implicit association test is a wonderful way of doing it, because it's not just about race. It can also be about gender expression, identity, sexuality. I mean, they have a test for just about everything. So really, how about that? They're going as intersectional as they absolutely can by providing all those instant tests for you to take. IAT, implicit association test.
Mm-hmm. And continue to come to events like this.
Yes.
Self-plug.
All right, looks like we've got another question here. In your perfect dream scenario, when you've expended the energy to give feedback to someone who has engaged in overt racism, implicit bias, microaggressions, how would the person you've given the feedback to respond?
Depends on the person for me. I've had this conversation before with someone, and they sat there quietly, and I told them, thank you for listening, and I left. And about 2 weeks later, we had another conversation where he absolutely broke down on me. And when I say broke down, was in tears because he didn't realize that in his moment of anger, wanting to place blame at different places, that he had crossed that many lines. And and again, was surprised that, as a guy that he played basketball with, that he's, um, that he's been friends with for a long time, uh, had never seen him like that. He was surprised that I would stay calm enough to tell him that instead of lashing out in anger. And I don't want to lead anyone astray. I was over the top, full of anger, and I had to ask myself: is the relationship worth my anger at this point in time, or is the education more important? And so in my perfect world, in that particular situation, it worked out. If it's someone I don't know, I have no relationship with, because as Amy said before, it is relational. It is absolutely relational. I want to create a better community for my children and ultimately my grandchildren, or even great grandchildren, or people I just simply like. I want to create a better community. So um, in different spaces and places, I would have this conversation right away. If it's someone I can get hands on and try to talk to, if they were ready to have that conversation, or if they were willing to have that conversation, I'm going to engage with it. Um, Depending on where we're at, is it safe for me to do it? Is it in a crowd of people that have the same mob mentality around this? Because at that point, I'm in the wrong place altogether, and I'm leaving. And I'm taking everybody that came with me out too. So it really depends on what's going on. But in the ideal situation, when this happens, I have the ideal person in front of me who's willing to hear someone else's point of view, even when they've been a total kind of butthead about it, and are willing to hear it out. Does that happen all the time? Probably not enough.
I couldn't agree more about how, and I feel like we're just parroting stuff we've already said, but it depends on the person. When you first asked that question, I thought, like, what would I want from like my parents if I was to have this conversation with them? And that looks way different than if I was to have it with my best friend. Marvin brings up really good points too, where conversations like that, you also need to consider personal safety sometimes when it comes to having those conversations, or is this the right setting to have that conversation? I speak for myself, but I think Marvin might agree, as well as probably others that are listening. The motivation in wanting to have those conversations is so that both people, myself and the other person I'm talking to, turn out to be better people by the end, that we have learned something, that something about us has changed and grown and developed, and that we can continue that on and carry it to have more conversations with even more people. And so that change doesn't just stick with us, it continues onwards. It becomes more expansive. It includes more voices, more people, more perspectives, more allies when it comes to those kinds of conversations. And so I don't think that there's any one perfect reaction that you can have, or that anyone can have when being confronted or discussing, if you will, some implicit bias type stuff that you've maybe been perpetuating. Because really, it's what you do with that matters more. Because, coming from a grad program that also had some counseling courses in it, people have reactions, emotional reactions on a spectrum. And all reactions are going to be considered normal. Depending on, how emotionally fueled this may be. Some people cry, some people might laugh, some people might get quiet, some people get angry. That's okay. But what I really want is that once you've got time to think it over, asking yourself, what are you going to do with that information that was given to you? How can you use that and help other people? Again, we're part of a helping profession. And so really that's what we want at the end of the day. We're not looking to shame people. We're not looking to make people angry. It's more about how can we make a better, healthier community.
I love that you said we're part of a helping profession. We're part of a healing profession. We're trying to do something. We've chosen to work in a field that over the course of the history of this country, there have been systems in place to maintain it and pull it apart. And yet here we are wanting to engage it and re-engage it and find creative ways to stay engaged with it. So in that, so Amy, that was spot on. And I think I wanted to add that piece about a healing profession, you know, because that's what we are doing. We are creating those relationships, hopefully, where people are willing to look at the bonds that have been broken, the social contracts that have been violated, and find ways to make it right. And in that, heal the communities that have been impacted by it. And when we talk about a perfect world in that scenario, one of the pieces that we left out is that we also have to have the energy for it. So in the perfect world, I have the energy when to go and do it. In the perfect world, I have the energy to start, and not just because of the relationship I'm in, because there are some real significant relationships now that because of the way things are nationally, that I really am picking my times to engage. And because why? Because I feel tapped. I feel tapped. I feel like those of us who are in the fight are usually also those of us that are most highly impacted by this, that are in this work, or those that have to then go home and deal with it. As you know, as Dr. Cornell West says, you know, here I am, world renowned, but when I get to New York and I get a cab, I have to think, aha, I let myself slip. I'm still a Black man in New York who can't get a cab. So for all that I'm worth, I'm still just a Black man in New York, you know, and so that's still a weight that we have to carry when we're also wanting to go out there and have these ideal conversations and with the ideal outcomes. If that happened every time, it would be worth it, but it doesn't, not at all. And so in that ideal world, that energy is there so that we can go and get it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will also say, in an ideal world, it is not just me and Marvin having these conversations. It is the people who are currently listening who are also going to be doing that. And so, while we can't currently have a perfect world, listeners, please do something. I'm asking you as a call to action to take what you've learned tonight and implement that with your family, your friends, your workplaces, within your community, your churches. It's going to matter, because I can tell you, like, I'm also tired, and I know many other people who do work similar to what Marvin and I do. They're also tired. That doesn't mean we're going to give up. You know, we've talked about why we currently do the jobs that we do, all the motivation that comes from, a lot of it coming from family. That's not going to go away for us. But for the people who don't necessarily have those same kind of motivators, you know, I'm calling you in. It's time to tap you in. We're going to tag team this, because it takes a village to really address some of these systemic issues. So I'll say that.
On that note, I'm going to jump ahead to the last question because it's important and I don't want to skip it. What advice can you give to those that want to be anti-racist but don't know where to start?
So Marvin and I were in a separate panel a couple of weeks ago where a similar question was asked, and I almost like whipped out a diagram talking about prevention work. But in my perspective, there are 4 different layers in your life that you can address that will help to guide some of the interactions and perhaps self-reflection that you're going to have to go through in order to be anti-racist. So the first layer is starting with yourself. So reflecting about, what do I know? What kinds of things have I been exposed to? And what areas am I not so familiar with? And start with those areas. And so that's where that whole self-guided, you know, reading might come in, or literature, education, trainings. Put yourself in spaces that you haven't been exposed to before, and just absorb what you're currently experiencing in those unfamiliar spaces. The next layer that I would suggest is, you know, reflect on, who do you surround yourself with when it comes to anti-racism work, and who can you help to include in that conversation or that reflection that you might be going through, whether or not that's a family member, a best friend, a church member. these groups that you're in, who else can you start to talk to about some of these things? So it's not just you talking to yourself, because that's not really going to get you very much anywhere. And then start talking about the community. Think about what are some of the norms that have been established in your community that actually perpetuate harm. And what can we do to prevent that? I think something that I've learned moving to Southern Oregon is one of the biggest things that's a concern is housing opportunities right now. And looking at, well, if we make it a norm that it's really, really hard to find a house, think about, well, what does that perpetuate? Well, that perpetuates that only people who have money are able to secure stable housing. That there's going to be segregated socioeconomic groups in certain areas, because it might be more expensive to live in one place than it is the other. And so people are going to choose to live in the lower rent area. But then the lower rent area is also going to come with lower funding for education for children. And then that's just going to create another pipeline to, the school to prison pipeline type stuff. You really need to look at what are the other norms that are occurring in your community, and doing something about that when you see that it's causing harm. And that's not just within, I think of past, because that's one community, but another community is your work environment, or just your social environments in itself too, because those are all different kinds of pods to create yourself in. And then finally, you got to get involved in politics. On a national level, you should be concerned and interested in social and educational policies that are going out right now. That's on the state level and on the national level. So those are the 4 kinds of layers that I would suggest people really look at and self-reflect on. What are some actions or goals that I can do in these layers to work towards being anti-racist? So I'm glad I didn't whip out a chart for you all, because I was going to, but I really didn't want to.
I have a chart for you all. Amy, we are of one soul. I like that. What we're talking about is changing our society, our social change, right? So we need a model that fits that, and there is a leadership model out there that fits it. The first component, as Amy said, is about self, recognizing your values, recognizing your challenges, recognizing your privilege, recognize where you've been oppressed, recognize where, some of us feel guilt, and there's no room for guilt in this work. There's no room for guilt in this work. You might want to take on some guilt because you've read something or you felt, and it's in your feelings. That's awesome. I think that's wonderful. But guilt can get people stuck, or it can make them go out there and want to do more than what they need to do it sometimes, or sometimes just less than what they should be doing. So there's no room for guilt. True and honest reflection of where you're at is important. So start with self. Start with your groups that you belong to. Go next to your groups, and then go to your community. And I believe in, as people say, guilty by association. I believe successful by association. I believe inclusive by association. I believe loved by my associations. And therefore, I enjoy being part of associations. So look at your groups and how those groups are embracing conversations or dialogues around inclusivity. Is it where you want to be or where you aspire to be, or is it at that low level, or is it complete denial? And then once you take a look at yourself, you take a look at those group pieces that you hold in your identity are tied to, then take a look at your community as a whole, because your groups impact your community, right? Your groups impact your community, which then inform you, the individual, which reinforce you back into the group. And so it's a bilateral movement between those 3 areas to me. It's a conveyor belt, So take a look at those pieces and really dig in, do the self-exploration, really lay out your values. And if your values are in line of what it takes to be an anti-racist, then how do I get myself to that point? And draw up your chart, set a goal for it, find your accomplices, find your co-conspirators, find those people that you can trust to have those dialogues with. Not a discussion, not a debate, a dialogue. Let's both walk away having learned something, and not just having learned something, having something to go and research so we can come back and we can share even more. Let's do that. Let's break it down in that way, and then let me do the same thing with my groups and how I take that knowledge and apply it to my groups to make it more inclusive or to create a different culture around it. And how do we then do that in our community? That's the social change model.
Mm-hmm.
I think anti-racist work is tied so closely to the social change model that if we were to embrace it and these were our values and we all jumped and moved that way, or most of us move that way, others would see it because it is about love. It is about acceptance. It is about embracing. It is about embracing.
Mm-hmm.
I love when community members become family members, where you realize that and for me as a basketball coach, from a collegiate team to middle school, um, when my oldest daughter's friends see me now, they still want to have conversations. They wanted to have conversations about Black Lives Matters. Marv, can I talk to you about that? Absolutely. Why? Because we built that relationship. We had those conversations. They were part of my group, and I engaged with them in the community. And so there's a trust factor that is there so that they know they can come here to get those answers, or at least get an ideal of what answers could look like. And then they get to go fish out the rest of it for themselves. So that's important to me. That social change model is very important. Self, your groups you belong to, and then your community. And then recognizing that you are on a conveyor belt. You might not be very aware at this point right here, and you really want to be on this point off screen. And everything will shift at some point, but it can shift both ways based on what's happening in the world around you and is influencing you, your associations you have that are impacting you. Those, things happen in life. But if it's really what you want to do and really where you want to be, stay moving forward on that belt. Don't let it shake you. But when it does shake you, forgive yourself. Fall back on the fact that I do want to do this work. I am not just a good person. Better yet, I'm not a bad person who wants to do this. I am a concerned citizen who wants to engage with it. So if I get stuck, I'm gonna forgive myself for being stuck. I'm gonna go find those associations that can help me help me move forward, and I'm gonna move forward as much as I can. But if I get stuck again, or even if I go backwards, I'm going to forgive myself because my goal is way off screen. I have to get there, and it may be hard. It may be easy for some. But if I have to get there, I'm going to keep moving towards that with my eyes on it and not stay put where I get stuck. So forgive yourself. Learn to do that too.
Mm-hmm.
And be honest. I
I
would
also
say be honest.
I also just want to emphasize, if you're like, I want to start, but I'm just not sure where, and I'm feeling really nervous or anxious, and I just don't want to be disrespectful, just start doing the work now. If it makes you feel better, I'm pretty sure that Marvin and I will forgive you. If you stumble and you fall, but you pick yourself back up, because we need more people who are willing to have these conversations, who are willing to put in the work. Anti-racism is not about neutrality. You need to do something. You need to start and take action. We talked about, that bystander reaction of saying, I'm just not racist. Well, if you're not doing anti-racism work, I'm not quite sure what you got from this webinar because you should be. Because really that's what this is all about. It's about understanding that you as an individual have the opportunity and the power to empower yourself and others. That's what we've been talking about this whole time. And so if you're just not sure where to start, just start somewhere. There is no one perfect place to start. Just begin and see where it takes you, where you end up, and the kinds of people that you'll meet and the conversations that you'll have, because I promise that it's worth it. When I started this kind of reflection for myself, which I'm not gonna lie, it started kind of late because mixed race individual, I was a confused baby. It started a little bit late, but once I started getting more into these spaces, more into these conversations, I also found myself. And I think that can also be a place of motivation, hopefully for other people who are saying, perhaps I'm feeling stagnant in life and I just feel like I need to do something. Do anti-racism work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's important too. You can't be neutral in this. And for a lot of people, I think get stuck is when you start talking about privilege, because a lot of folks feel like they don't have privilege, yet they're part of the privileged group. Remember, privilege is tied to access. You know, it's tied to access. Do you have to access to things? So, you know, start with examining, you know, how am I privileged? How am I not? What have I done with that privilege? How can my privilege be used to change this society we live in?
Mhm.
Who are the people that help me do that? You know, that's very important. So we start getting to that point in that conversation with yourself, you're moving forward. And for me, that really is that first spot. That first spot on that conveyor. Can I confront my own privilege? If I cannot, I'm still at the denial phase. I'm still at that point. But keep your eyes on the prize, even if you are. And and don't be afraid to ask the questions, not because I'm formulating a conversation because I have to debate this with you. We're not here to debate. Ask that question because this is a truly important question to my growth, and I hope that you are willing to help me. I have two friends when everything was happening over summer. Black Lives Matter movement was up. You know, the shootings were up. Um, a friend of mine, I called because I had a conversation with a family member who's a police officer, and it didn't go well. And yet we walked out hugging each other, saying that we're not done talking about this. And we've had probably 5 more conversations since then. So we've come to a place of understanding. But this other friend, who's a teammate and a competitor, an opponent at times, is also a police officer. And we end up having a 4-hour conversation with another friend of ours who's a social scientist, you know, 3 different masters. He's a social guru. But we end up having this conversation for 4 hours, and we've done this. You know, we get together. Let's just sit down and unpack it. And we are all across the spectrum, from conservative to liberal to ultra liberal. You know, to law enforcement, law and order, to justice. I mean, we're having all these different conversations. And does it get heated? It does, but the foundation of it is that, do we trust each other enough to have this conversation without walking out as enemies, but walking out motivated to learn more about ourselves and our own views? And that has fueled my Saturdays. I love when these guys get on. We have other friends who are now trying to join us, and they live all across the world. I'm talking guys from Australia that we play ball with that want to be part of the conversation. You know, a couple of wives have been part of the conversation. Some partners want to be part of the conversations. And we've said no to a few of them. Why? Because we've created something that was so spectacular and organically authentic.
Mhm. So
Trust me.
you're gonna make friends doing anti-racism work.
You're going to make it, and they're going to want to have those hard conversations. And that, to me, when you have people you trust, that's when it's successful. That's when it's really starting to shake and move things. That's when I start to have more and more faith in where I'm at and what I'm doing.
All right. That was our last panelist question that we had prepared tonight. Are there any other questions from the audience? I will give you a few moments to type something out.
While we're giving people a little bit of time to type, I just wanted to say thank you guys again for coming. This has been amazing, and you guys have had a ton of insightful and great answers. So thank you.
Yeah, happy to be.
Yes, definitely. Thank you guys. It was a real safe space, I felt. So thank you for initiating the conversation here.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone who showed up and listened. You know, it's better to not talk to yourself.
Thank you all
Okay.
for being here.
All right. Well, the chat looks quiet with a lot of thanks to you guys. So thank you, everybody. If you think of any other questions or have anything you wanted to ask but didn't want to type it for everyone to see, you're welcome to reach out to the library and we can pass on your questions, or the panelists directly if they are okay with it. Amy and Marvin, if you would like, could you please put your emails in the chat for attendees? And once again, a big thank you to our panelists and all the Consider This and Rogue Read sponsors for helping make this program happen. A quick reminder that for registering to attend this program, we do have gift cards to local restaurants available for pickup at the Ashland, Jacksonville, and Medford branch libraries while supplies last. and you're welcome to pick them up tomorrow or later this week if you weren't able to get yours before tonight. Be sure to check out the Rogue Reads book selections from Jacqueline Woodson and future programs that can be found on the Rogue Reads page on our website, which I am putting in the chat right now.
While you're doing that, we got one last question. How do you engage in self-care?
I wrote kind of a quick answer to that one where I said it's spicy food, my partner, counseling, midnight chats. There's just so many different strategies that I've started to utilize over the years. I will say when it comes to self-care, so many people are talking about it now. There's so many articles, there's so many different organizations that are bringing attention to it. And so I'll just say self-care starts with doing what you know.
Right.
You know, there's no magic wand. Everyone's talking about the same strategies. Implement them. They actually do work. It's why people talk about them. You know, get a good night's sleep, set personal boundaries for yourself. Make sure that you're taking a pulse on how you're emotionally doing throughout the day and honoring the fact that if you need a break, that's not a failure. That's being human, and just so many other things. You know, it really depends on who the person is. I also love essential oils, and like I have a 19-year-old cat that like I cuddle with all the time. It just really depends on the person. But again, stuff is out there. Follow what the advice that you're reading because it really does work.
It does. Gosh, self-care for me, I am probably the worst at it, but when I engage wholeheartedly. So self-care at times is look like fishing trips out to Agate Lake, Lost Creek, Shasta Lake, Clear Lake. I'll just jump in and explain to the lovely one that, dear Lisa, I'm going fishing, don't know when I'll be back. Love you. So I tend to get out in nature, especially now with us being kind of cooped in with COVID-19. As soon as I get a chance to get a break, I drive straight for the hills and get out and go walk outside. And I'm notorious for falling asleep in the back of my in the bed of my truck, just because it's so nice to just breathe. And I think that's the biggest part is my self-care starts with understanding that breathing, you know, that deep breath and that exhale. And you can't always calm your mind, you can't always calm your heart, but you can give your body what it needs. Just that deep breath, big glass of water, and a gumbo, and I'm good.
Do what makes you feel centered.
Do what makes you feel safe. Absolutely.
Just
Find
keep
your
tabs
spot.
on it doing excessively though. That's all I'll say.
I have eaten too much gumbo. You're absolutely right.
All right. Well, this concludes our program for the night. Thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your evening. Thank you so much for being here.